Hello. Ooh, hello, everyone. What I'm going to be discussing today is how to set cross-chain standards in a way to actually bring this reality that we know is inevitably coming of a cross-chain blockchain ecosystem forward more. My name is Jacob, and I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Turn. So for those who don't know about Turn, Turn is a smart contract hosting protocol that allows for cross-chain execution. What's unique about Turn is that we have this fail-proof mechanism built into the protocol itself. What that means is that should a transaction fail at any point during a cross-chain execution, we can revert back the effects that had happened up until that point. So the way of thinking about it would be when we're talking about a single ledger system, for example, on Ethereum, if you're executing a multi-step transaction, if you run out of gas at some point, you know that everything's going to get reverted back and the side effects won't be written down. We're matching that and moving that essentially across into the cross-chain realm. What this allows for is essentially composable execution in a cross-chain environment where transactions can compose from one another and allow for more complex functionalities in the cross-chain realm. So, for example, you'll be able to remove liquidity on Ethereum, send those tokens over to Polkadot, do a token swap on Polkadot, say get Glimmer, and then deposit that into a liquidity pool on Moonbeam. And you can do that knowing that this four-step transaction, if something fails at point 3, everything gets reverted back that's happened up until that point. Essentially, how we view it is that this is what DeFi and using blockchain should be and always have been. The other unique aspect of our protocol, which I will be touching on a bit later, is our developer reward system. We have an open source smart contract repository that developers can deposit smart contracts into and get remunerated every time someone comes in and uses their smart contract. So this is the UI that we've put together. We'll be launching quite soon. We've been on Rococo since June. I'm going to be pushing live quite soon. Essentially, this is what it looks like when you're interacting with Turn. You're able to essentially drag and drop different functionalities in steps, knowing that once you submit a transaction like this, if something fails at, let's say, step 2, everything gets reverted back. This is, the sort of the retail-focused aspect of the protocol. Obviously, there's more complex things going on in the background, but it's a very good way of visualizing what we're actually building. Obviously, security within cross-chain is probably one of the most important aspects of it. And so we achieve that through essentially having a light client that confirms everything that's happened, looks out for results, and then Circuit, which is our blockchain, looks for the proofs in block headers and confirms that everything is valid and as it should be. We're very flexible with what languages we work with, so Ink, Solidity, anything that WASM compiles is good for us. Now, what I'm going to be talking about in this talk in particular is the narratives around cross-chain and what's going to push for the next major bull cycle in crypto. I'll be discussing the problem with bridges, and then we'll move on to XEM, why it is a great step in the right direction, as well as XBI, which is a standard that we've proposed as Turn to make XEM more usable. So the first thing to think about is what stimulates real innovation in any space. So there's a theory in an article written by Danny Grant and Nick Roseman called The Myth of Infrastructure, that apps beget infrastructure, meaning that you first need to create an app and a use case before the infrastructure to enable that and scale it follows. So if you think about it from a perspective of something like this, where you're looking at messaging, an email existed long before Ethernet, TCP/IP, SendMail, and so on. So the app was there before the infrastructure scaled out. And this is interesting to think about within the context of crypto, because a lot of infrastructure is being built, but not a lot or not enough people are still using it. And so the theory would be that maybe there needs to be an app created that then begets the infrastructure that needs to be built to stimulate its adoption. This feeds into our thesis as we're developing Turn, in that we want to enable people to build this potential next, quote-unquote killer app, while also providing the infrastructure to make that a reality. So if you're looking at something like this, bear in mind this article was written in 2018, so this is a bit dated. You see that something like CryptoKitties, which then sort of really pushed the adoption of ERC 721, and created things like OpenSea and so on. So that killer app needed to be there for that next level of infrastructure to start being built. And so the question is, how do you think about and how do you enable this infrastructure to be built? So the state of things now, well, the problem with bridges, I'd say, is probably quite clear. So as bridges stand now, the easiest setup is essentially either closed federated systems and proof of authority models, or open and large proof of stake models. Both aren't without their flaws. You look at something like proof of authority models, obviously doesn't really tie into what the real spirit of blockchain and open source is and should be. And then you look at things like proof of stake models, which theoretically are good, but still don't come without their problems of the initial actors within those ecosystems really cementing their places, and there being very little flexibility and openness about bringing in new actors into those ecosystems. Similarly, it does open up potential hacks through essentially collusion. So you look at something like poor security design of bridge consensus, which causes high risk of collusion, and then the other problem with cross-chain is buggy implementations. So you look at something like Ronin, obviously one of the most notorious hacks to happen in the space as a whole. Essentially what happened there was 9 validators, and 4 were being run by Sky Mavis, the guys behind Axie Infinity. And so all a malicious actor needed to do was to break or take control of one more validator to fully be able to drain the network of liquidity. They essentially did that. So Sky Mavis set up a system to gas optimize as much as possible during moments of high traffic for Axie Infinity. And essentially this was meant to last for a month. It didn't last for a month, they just left it running. And so the malicious actor was able to take control of that other validator, as well as the other 4, and drain north of $600 million from the protocol. The most insane thing about this, obviously, being that nobody noticed for 6 days that $620 million was gone, which I'm not sure how that happens. Another sort of problem with cross-chains, obviously buggy implementations. You can look at something like the Bifrost hack. Essentially, the hacker was able to wrap the router with their own contract and just get a loop going and just drain the protocol for, well, a mere $5 million, but it still does demonstrate the issue with buggy implementations. So now we can talk about what the future looks like and what progress looks like and why we're very much heading in the right direction and what needs to be achieved to make that a reality. So looking at XCM and Polkadot as a whole, from a security standpoint, it is in a very great place. You get the publicly verifiable grandfather finality proofs, making it easy to implement provable light clients on top of it. You also look at the amount of validators on the network, over 1,000, over 20,000 nominators as well, with over 50% of all DOT staked. I think that's not something to be scoffed at. It's an incredible achievement in itself and really does, reinforce the security that Polkadot offers. That said, the XCM, cross-chain messaging passing protocol, isn't perfect by any means. And it is so by design. It's very generic, which it needs to be for it to work. It doesn't really adapt to particular use cases. And because of this, you've got a lot of projects using it and adopting it in quite different ways, which means that it's not particularly a standard unanimous adoption of it, which, in some regards slows down how it's actually used. There's no consistent notification standard about message delivery and results, so you've got guarantees about the delivery of messages, but you don't know what the results are that you get back. And yeah, it's just not a standard that is being used unanimously across the board in the same way as it needs to be to really deliver on its promise. So what XBI does is designed to be a simple, essentially, extension of XCM, one that allows for new use cases to start emerging. So if you look at something like, an epitome of the problem that we're trying to solve is like for the assets function, you've got ORML, which is developed by Akala, and then transfer assets, which is the sort of standard parity palette. And they're both being used, differently in different ways. And so that sort of lack of broad synchronized adoption of XCM essentially goes against what the protocol was developed to do, which is, really easily pass and transfer messages in a cross-chain realm. And so that's what XBI does. It's essentially a flexible standard that can be added without any runtime upgrade that allows for a more synonymous use of XCM. So what it does, it converts between arguments and results of WASM and EVM smart contracts. So essentially, as is becoming very much the trend, especially within the Polkadot ecosystem, everyone seems to have their own VM. You look at something like XCVM from Composable. I think Astar are working on their own VM as well. Something like a XBI format allows for a more consistent inter-VM use of XCM. The metadata standardizes result callbacks and notifications for each message. So you know what you're going to get, you know what the results are, you know what the timeouts are as well. So essentially it's a coherent high-level API for smart contracts on all remote ecosystems. And so our development of this is being pushed by the Web3 Foundation. It's the second grant we've got as a project. And it essentially highlights this need for XCM to be used in a coherent way throughout the ecosystem. As part of the fulfillment of the grant, XCM will be, XBI, will be then pushed to be adopted as a PSP, a Polkadot standard proposal. Like I said, it does really highlight this need for consistent use of a protocol like XCM to sort of level up cross-chain communication. As part of XBI, we want to make it keep as much stress of the network as possible, or the parachain runtime. So a lot of the actions do happen off-chain. So all the queue, the inputs and outputs are all processed off-chain to really keep the stress off a parachain as much as possible when adopting XBI. So it is very much an efficient way to standardize XCM as well. So essentially, this is what XBI offers. It's seamless parachain integration. It's a lightweight wrapper to XBI portal, expected to be added as a dependency to all palettes responsible for dispatching new XBI messages. So it's no events, no storage, only just dispatchable calls. And essentially, it just handles XBI lifecycle, so as part of the XBI portal. It handles the XBI lifecycle, so notifications, check-ins, checkouts, and dispatches and forwards XBI orders to their destination. And then the pallet tray is configurable, essentially very much a plug-and-play model where you can choose what functionalities are enabled through XBI. So whether you just want something like WASM, but not EVM, but you want it to be compatible with OMRL, you can configure that in a very simple plug-and-play model. And so why are we doing this? So as I mentioned, this is a need we feel to really standardize and make the use of XCM as broad as possible. Turn is going to use the XBI protocol to communicate with other parachains, and the more adoption we see of XBI, the more useful and the broadens the utility of XCM and makes cross-chain communication all the easier and seamless. And then this harks back to the point I made at the beginning, that whether apps beget infrastructure or infrastructure begets apps. We're sort of approaching it from both perspectives at Turn. We're building the cross-chain infrastructure to allow projects to interact in seamless ways, to enable things like DeFi in a way that we always thought should be the case. but we're also developing this system that incentivizes the creation of different potential apps that we can then cater and develop infrastructure for. Now, what I mean when I say that is, as part of a smart contract repository that we have, if a developer contributes code to that, anyone can then go in and deploy their smart contract and the original author, because a contract is developed, deployed with full on-chain provenance, does then get remunerated every time that smart contract is used. And what that means is that we're creating this ecosystem that stimulates, innovation in a way that allows for this potential next, I don't like this phrase, but killer app to be developed, where we can then start catering the infrastructure that we build to further push and develop that and stimulate its adoption. So when you think about the infrastructure and the app cycle from the initial slides I showed, we're working and tackling the problem from both sides. And so, that's the end of the talk, essentially. What we really believe is that we need to work and tackle these problems from both sides, because, looking at what's happened in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space recently, DeFi has taken considerable reputational hits. Whether NFTs are that killer use case, I'd like to think that we're doing more here than, just pushing pictures of monkeys, basically, and actually developing something really meaningful. And so we're trying to create that infrastructure that stimulates and allows people to create that meaningful stuff. So feel free to reach out if you want to join us and be part of this mission. We're always hiring. We're also looking for ambassadors to push the message of the project forward. Always looking for developers to join this ecosystem and contribute to this open source smart contract repository. And always, as always, for something like XBI to really bring the value that it potentially can, it needs to be adopted. A standard is only as good as the amount of people who are using it. So we're always open to partners to join our GitHub repository where we're working on XBI and help us refine it, help us make it cater to every single project who could potentially need it. Thanks for your time. Much appreciated.
Hi. My question is about the reconciliation of XCM transfers. Like they have an outgoing message, an outgoing transfer, and an incoming transfer on the destination chain. Is there anything being done or thought about when it comes to reconciling those two? Because right now they don't share a unique ID. So if I want to track where, from the perspective of the outgoing chain, the destination chain, where is this coming from, or where this transaction has originated? It's kind of hard to track. I'm speaking from a data perspective because I'm with Subsquid, and so we're interested in just indexing this kind of transactions.
So speaking from a non-data perspective, I would probably direct you to my CTO, who's sitting right there, who will definitely be able to answer that question in a more coherent and technical way. Apologies.
Do you want the mic?
Yeah, sure.
I can share mine. The same, on the scene. It's perfect.
Yeah, so as part of metadata, we have an ID, so you can essentially, if you want to keep on track which specific messages you're arriving, you can generate your own IDs, set as metadata, so it becomes part of essentially the proof of a protocol. So then on the output, when you're dispatching the messages back through the callbacks, you can then keep on track and make your own resolvers to whatever it is that you then need to link your initial transactions to. So yeah, this has been thought through this way. I think the best if, we probably catch up later and then you go into details what is in XBI metadata, because there is also some other funky stuff like aggregated costs, aggregated costs of delivery to essentially have one input that gets you through all of the hops that you need to have. So goes into the gas fees, then goes into all of the credits that you need to have for dispatching XCM. So IDs, aggregated costs, this is all something that we kind of think of how to make it useful for actually the end use cases to then look for.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Cheers.